So I welcome the viewers today to the video. Well, let me first say I have a guest that I'm going to introduce you to, Sue Brown from Cape Town in South Africa. And we very sadly share the same experience of having lost a child to a brain tumor. And the series of videos that I'm doing in this month of June is to shatter the silence surrounding grief, because no one speaks about it after sort of the first week. You expect it just to get over it. The way that society is doing grief, according to the author Megan Devine, is society is doing it in a broken way. And we then, who are the parents or spouses who are dealing with grief, we are on the receiving end of that brokenness and trying to find our way through an incredibly challenging journey where we're not really able to speak about it hugely. So I welcome you, Sue, from Cape Town. Welcome to this interview.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you for the invitation. It's lovely chatting to you.
Okay, so Sue is going to tell us her story, but before she launches into that, she has written a book called The Twinkling of an Eye, which is a book about her story and the family story in their loss of Craig. It's the most amazing book because it really speaks directly to the mothers of children that have been lost. So very thought-provoking, but very emotive, and just provides such insight into the pain of mothers, particularly mothers who have lost children. Sue has also, which is currently at the publishers, she's written a set of essays. If you are wanting to have more information about that, we'll put the information at the end of the video. There'll be links that you can go to have a look at that. So Sue, are you comfortable that we just dive straight in?
Yeah, that's what we've learned to do with grief, I think. What they say, block your nose and yeah, jump.
We just jump. So I think my first thing I'd like you to speak about is if you can just briefly tell us about what happened to Craig, the journey. Yeah, if there are other little questions along the way, I'll prompt them. But otherwise, just to give us an idea of your journey with Craig.
Thank you, Sherry. Yeah, Craig, I have two children. I had two children. I had a daughter, and then 2 years later, Craig was born. So Craig was my younger child. And he died during his grade 7 year in the August, just after his 13th birthday, from the brain tumor. Throughout his grade 6 year, he wasn't really himself. It took about a year to really work out what was going on, behavioral changes, problems with schoolwork, and then latterly nausea and a bit of vomiting. So it was really, he was only diagnosed on the New Year's Eve of 2010. So yeah, it was obviously, again, it was a huge shock to have the diagnosis. At the same time, it explained this child who'd just been so, difficult on so many levels throughout that year. Yeah, Craig felt completely vindicated because his teachers had been cross with him and we'd been cross with him. And he told me in hospital he was going to put a little collection bowl and anybody who felt bad was welcome to make a donation. So yeah, so he was diagnosed on the New Year's Eve of 2010, and yeah, he had 2 successful operations actually, which managed to remove all the tumor, and he had follow-up radiation. But by the June of that year, when he had a follow-up scan, the cancer had been so aggressive that it actually had spread throughout his brain. So we had about 2 months and very shortly after that scan, he had a huge bleed from one of the tumors, and he was pretty much semi-conscious for another 2 months. So we had hospice care, and yeah, he died at home at the end of August. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
One can put that in a nutshell,
yeah, I mean, it's such a huge story, but it's trying to just to put our viewers in the picture of kind of where you are speaking from.
Yeah. And that was about 9 years ago.
Okay. And so because of the tumors, from what you're saying, it actually had started to affect his, or did affect his behavior quite drastically.
Yes. Yeah. Craig had always been a very intense, outspoken child. He was really tricky as a toddler. And then he had a very strong sense of right and wrong. And when the tumor, obviously he had raised intracranial pressure from the tumor, which was what we didn't realize. So he'd kind of lost the inhibition that he had learned as he'd grown up. So, he'd obviously, as one learns to manage those strong emotions, again, suddenly at 12, he was saying things, and I'd say to him, "Why did you say that, Craig?" And he said, "Mom, I don't know." And we'd have these discussions about how we behave and what we can say and what's appropriate. And he had lost that control over his reactions to other people. It was actually quite a relief once he'd had the 2 surgeries, because then the pressure in his brain was normalized, and it felt like our child again. Yeah.
Okay, so after the death of Craig, very often what happens is we're busy trying to cope with that huge trauma of the fact that our child is no longer with us. And then in the months that follow, as Claire Wiley calls it, there are lots of aftershocks that can happen. So it's almost as if the death of your child is the earthquake, and then you get the aftershocks coming through and they literally do hit you and steamroll over you. So, Sue, what was the nature? Firstly, did you have aftershocks? And if so, what was the nature of them?
In a way, it felt as if the whole of life was a bit of an aftershock, because life was the same and social events were the same when we got invitations to similar things, but we were completely different people, and I didn't know how to navigate them. We didn't know how we were going to cope with, if we accepted that invitation to have supper with people, was that going to be bearable or not? So I think it's almost like you're this incredibly raw being who is now out in the world. And my husband and I, we had absolutely no idea. I suppose over the years of our marriage, we'd worked out which things we would accept, which we wouldn't, what we liked doing. And suddenly we had to renegotiate all of that. Or we'd accept an invitation to something, and it would be a celebration and there would be a speech, and it was just too much. And then what does one then do? Do you hang in there till the end of the event? I was told by a counselor that actually you may just politely vanish and send an apology later. So it was just completely re-navigating the world. And it's caused stresses between the 2 of us, because sometimes my husband's more socially wired. He could do it because he wanted to be there, because it was somebody else's birthday and he wanted to support them. And I was screaming inside. I just couldn't do it. As much as I liked the person, it was difficult. And just so many things caught me by surprise. I'd go grocery shopping, and one of the worst things was seeing the lychee liquid fruit or the salty cracks that he was the person in the family I bought them for. And I'd be devastated. And so I'd brace myself for the things that I saw coming, but I hadn't braced myself for the lychee liquid fruit or the bubble gum at the checkout that he always wanted to buy, and I didn't want to buy for him. And I'm going, why didn't I buy him the bubble gum? So it's sometimes those really little things that just blindside you. And I'd never cried. I'd never cried in public, and I'd be weeping in the aisle in Pick and Pay. And it's
don't feel alone there. I also used to be caught in the local grocery shop weeping over the frozen peas. And actually at that time, I just thought, I'm not going to try and stop any emotion from coming through. I can't. It's just too powerful. So wherever I am, whether I'm in public or not, if the tears are there, I'm just going to let them come. And for me, that was a really, it might have been quite off-putting for other people, but for me, it was the right thing, because I didn't have to have that stress of, oh my word, I mustn't cry now because I'm in public. I would just do it.
Yeah, if I can interrupt, I found that there's tears and tears there. I didn't mind those ones that I could then mop myself up and get myself together again. But sometimes it's almost like one has a fault line, and something would get into that fault line. It would often be a speech at a birthday party, or someone who very kindly, I loved it if we went to an event. It made it so much more bearable if people acknowledged that Craig wasn't there.
Yeah.
But if at the one they said a little prayer for Craig and they hadn't warned me, and then I started weeping and I couldn't stop. It took me about 2 hours and a few rolls of blue paper in their bedroom. So it's such a fine line, because there are tears. There's some that you can pull yourself back together again, and the others where it's gone right down that fault line and you don't see it coming. And I think I've had to accept that I'm a physio by training. You know, I'm used to being the one who's sort of the in control one, and I've had to get used to being the vulnerable, weepy one.
I think it is a big learning curve, and in fact, then from that vulnerability grows our strength. But that only comes later. Initially, it is very difficult to negotiate things that normally would have been easy to do, and suddenly there are all these mines or bombs, I don't know what to call them, where you're trying to negotiate it very carefully, but suddenly, as you say, the bubblegum then will just be in your view, and you weren't expecting that, and it can derail you. And I'm so glad you spoke about the different kind of tears, because there are times when you can cry gently, and the other cries that it comes from your boots. And those are the ones that are very, hopefully they don't happen when you're in public, because we almost need to just be on our own or with our husband or loved ones then, because it's such a raw grieving.
I felt very much for my daughter at one, because we were at a friend's 13th birthday a few years after Craig had died, and she was about 16 at the time, which is a vulnerable, very sensitive age. And I started crying and I couldn't stop crying. And she's then needing to, obviously it must on some level have been triggering her pain, but she was keeping it all together. And I didn't ever go back and revisit with her of how had it actually felt for her to see me in such a, broken's maybe not the right word, but in such an emotional space in a public, and she was almost keeping it together to compensate for the weepy mother. So it's almost a double burden on her.
Yeah. So how old was Meg when Craig died?
He actually died 2 days before her 15th birthday.
Okay, just so that our viewers can get an idea of how old she was.
So she's in grade 9, which is it's a hard age. You know, you're just entering your teens.
Yeah. If you're comfortable, can we speak a little bit about the siblings? So our daughter Kathleen was grade 7 when Kerry died, so she was younger than Meg. But that grade 9 year, having been a teacher of girls, they don't know where they belong. They're not children anymore, but they're not yet the big grown-up girls. So it's an incredibly difficult age, even as a teacher. So the fact that Meg was at that age when Craig died, wouldn't have made it easier for her. But maybe if you can just mention briefly how Meg coped with it initially, or how has she been dealing with it?
I suppose, personalities of children are so different. She's always been a very reserved, contained, academic child. And I think because she coped so well with it on the surface, we didn't realize how much it hurt. I think I probably just didn't have the capacity to actually engage with her on the level of what pain was she actually feeling. And I mean, literally that year, she still came top of her grade. She continued doing the same right through school. And I think that also makes me sad that I am part of the society that judges how well somebody is coping and how well they're feeling by the measurables.
Yeah.
and the achievements, because she carried on, being sweet, lovely, gentle, considerate, and I think we underestimated how she was feeling because she was keeping it all to herself.
Yeah. And so, I mean, Sue, we all make mistakes in a journey where we don't know where we're going. If you had to look back, are there certain things that you, particularly regarding Meg, are there things that you would have done in a different way with hindsight?
I think it would have been trying to just engage more with her in conversation about, not maybe just directly how she was feeling, because I think as a teenager, often even that's really hard to access because there's so much else going on in your life. But I remember very clearly the first anniversary of Craig's death, which everybody, that the first and the second is just, when you're talking about aftershocks, I mean, those are particular minefields. And Neil wanted to organize a soccer party with his name is Neil, with all Craig's friends. And I wanted to go and hide away somewhere with just him and Meg. And it caused a lot of conflict between us because what Neil needed to do to honor his son was the opposite to what, and we've always been like that, the introvert and the extrovert, but the grief emphasized that. And I think when you're grieving, you have less capacity to compromise. So we had a lot of conflict about that. And we went to the counselor, and the counselor sort of turned to us and said, and what does your daughter think? And that just hadn't even occurred to me. I don't think it occurred to either of us. Is actually how she's feeling, what will make this day bearable and appropriate for her. And I think even though we heard that from him, our emotional capacity just wasn't adequate. And we were learning to deal with grief. And it's something you kind of learn, that very deep grief, you're learning on the job.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's really hard to say. In retrospect, I would have paid that much more attention to engaging with her.
Yeah, our daughter Kathleen as well sounds very similar to Meg. Also very, she's the introvert. Also went back to school. In fact, Kerry died on the Sunday, and she was back at school on the Monday. Her choice. And also just carried on. Also academically did well, sport did well, socially did well, and it was almost like I felt that I didn't want to affect her or come in where I'm not welcome. And so for me, it was a huge challenge as to how much to speak with her and how much not to speak with her, because I didn't want to make her uncomfortable. And so what I also found was that as she got older, so she dealt with the grief in a different way, a more mature way. So when she was 12, when she was 16, and now she's 30 and a married lady, and is far more relaxed about it now. She can speak about it more openly. But just to give you an idea, when she went off to university, the way she told all her friends, because now it's a whole new ball game, the way she told her friends that she had lost her younger sister was she wrote a very beautiful piece and she just put it on Facebook, which for her was very comfortable to do. And then she didn't have to necessarily have all the interaction that was happening. But I think the getting back to Meg, the whole idea of dealing with the siblings is a very difficult one, because the parents are overwhelmed anyway just with their own grief. And very often the siblings aren't given what they are needing at that time. And because they don't want to overload us even more, to say, hey, mom, dad, look at me, they do just keep it together. And that puts immense pressure on them, which maybe they don't even realize at the time. And it only
I think it was,
Yeah.
I think it must be exhausting. And I think it's possibly a load they take on subconsciously. They're not consciously doing it. It's just what you do in order to try and keep your family life manageable. I think too, in a way, they've lost their sibling, but they've also kind of lost their parents as they were, because we also now become these really raw, difficult, moody.
Yeah.
So in a way, they've lost. It must be terrifying to see your parent falling apart. When I say falling apart, that's not the wrong word, but very vulnerable. They're probably more used to a parent who's, at least on the surface, seems to have it a bit more together.
Yeah.
So there is that loss of your parents as you knew them, as well as, and I've also thought too, is kind of the loss of Craig. For my husband and I, we were in our mid-40s. We had a fair amount of life experience, and thankfully not this type of loss. But it was an adult mind that it was falling in. And I often wonder, with that kind of incredible, the trauma of the reality that your sibling is dead is just an incredibly, I mean, I think that's why I sat and wrote the book, because I couldn't get just the reality of a child physically being dead and not here anymore is just mind-boggling. And that's in a so-called adult mind.
Yeah.
And I think for an emotional mind that is still developing, I think that trauma must be that much more powerfully felt. If I'm
more
explaining
powerfully
myself.
felt, but maybe not unable to express. Maybe.
Yeah. And we didn't have the skills from not just from grief, but I suppose just from our own upbringings, to actually really have those conversations about emotions. You know, we're products of the 60s and the 70s, and it wasn't part of our upbringing, this whole language of speaking about how we're feeling. It was always about what shall we do about this.
Yeah, it's a difficult, because we all are new to that process, all in the same time, all floundering together. And so families deal with it, obviously, as we deal with grief. Everybody is individual. We deal with it in different ways. I think with the siblings, it's very difficult, because you can't be the mom or dad that you used to be, because you're not that person. You haven't got the capacity. You are floundering, and you've only got a finite amount of emotional energy. And so whereas normally we would give a lot more to our children generally, suddenly we're not giving that they are used to. And I think that's also a big part of the problem.
Jerry, if I can interject as well, I think for Neil and I, although we grieved completely differently because of the people we are just our temperaments, our loss was still equivalent. You know, we had both lost a child. And I think particularly for a child, when there isn't another child, it must be an incredibly lonely place, because you've got cousins and you've got friends, but there's nobody else who has actually suffered the same loss in the family as them. So in that way, it's completely how Neil and I deal with it is one issue, but our loss is the same.
Yeah, agreed.
And for one surviving sibling, I think you're navigating it completely by yourself. As much as we could all support, there's nobody else who on a gut level can say, I feel what you feel. Because I think, people might say, I've lost, a certain member in my family. I know how you feel. They don't know how you feel.
Very, very, very relevant point there, Sue. Thank you for actually bringing that to our viewers. So while we're on the family, how did your extended family, so I'm talking about the grandparents, your siblings and Neil's siblings, and the cousins of Craig, generally, did they deal with it well, or did you find there was maybe a bit of pressure coming from them in any way?
I think everybody does the best they absolutely can. I think that's what one has to acknowledge down the line, is as much as now and then one might be, as with anybody, you might be offended that somebody said something or didn't say something, that actually everybody who's in your space is doing their absolute best given what they came with. And I think I think I felt, but it wasn't just because of this, it's how I've always felt the need to be slightly make it all right in the family. And, so if my parents were concerned about my children, I would do my best to, and I couldn't make it nice for anybody. I couldn't give them good news. I couldn't comfort them. I found that terribly hard to have to accept that I couldn't sugarcoat it.
Mm.
I didn't have it wasn't a story I could sugarcoat, and I didn't have the capacity to go that extra mile for other people. So sometimes, say, if Neil had more of a capacity than I did for thinking that, say, one of our parents might be struggling, to actually make an extra effort with them. I didn't have that capacity. I wasn't even doing it adequately for my daughter, never mind my parents. I didn't have the capacity to pay my parents or other siblings, or probably nieces and nephews. I didn't have the energy to worry about how they were feeling and to try and help them through it. I couldn't help anybody else.
And that's that's a very difficult place to be, particularly if you have been the person that's always made it right. Suddenly here's something that you can't make right.
Yeah. And I couldn't make anybody feel better. Yeah. And I was in a way, obviously, it's hard for them to see you grieving, but I couldn't help that either. Yeah.
I think I would like to just add in here, very often all the attention is on the mother and father, and sometimes a sibling, depending on how things are in your community. But the people that often get overlooked are the grandparents, and they're suffering a double loss, because they are suffering the loss of their grandchild, and they are having to deal with the pain of their own child. So it's like a double whammy. And I think we were very blessed coming from Hilton, very small community, and people were amazing, because they would usually say to me, how's Mike doing? How's Kathleen doing? How's Mike's mum? And how are my parents? They would always ask after them. And that was very meaningful to me. So to poor viewers out there, if you do know somebody who has lost their child and you happen to know the parents, please just make a little bit of special effort there, because they feel they're floundering as well, and they don't feel that they've got any real status, because they're not the family. I hope I'm making sense. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And I think their loss is minimized. And also for the grandparents, they're also at a stage of life where they're coping with other losses. So I think it's, particularly difficult. And their sense of helplessness must be huge. Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. As parents, we want to make it better, and we...
Yeah. I mean, we want to make it better for our parents. They want to make it better for us, and neither of us can do that. So it is a very fraught time.
I think we were very fortunate in having a larger community as well, who did, to a large extent, help everybody in various ways, and at various times, not just when Craig was sick, but when he died, but also the ones who, would go and make contact a year later and say, how are you doing? Those ones that just remain in the background for when the aftershocks do come.
Yeah, because initially everybody's there, but then it's who is going to be there for the long distance. And to be involved in a community like you were in Cape Town, a very loving school, a loving environment, makes a huge difference. So we were very blessed, both of us, in that regard, in that we got immense support from the local community.
I tell you, it helps too. I mean, I feel for people too who lost much younger children, because I think, say, for my child, a lot of people knew him for who he was. So there were a lot of other people that remembered him and missed him. And I've often thought that if you lose a baby, it must be that much harder, because those other people didn't have their own relationships with that child. I found that hugely helpful when Craig's friends and other families, without even consulting us, did things to honor Craig, to remember Craig, had their own get-togethers when I didn't want to get together with the whole group. They all got together and sent me photographs on his birthday and things like that. So the fact that those other people had relationships with your child takes the pressure off.
Yeah,
and
absolutely. And for the babies that have died, there's also, you will always wonder what kind of people they would have grown into. So that is like a loss on top of a loss. Whereas we knew that the essence of our children. We knew that Craig was very outgoing and very loving of soccer and loving sport and loving of his friends, and you could see he was really out there. So
and a short life, but I'm interrupting you. So a short life, he'd made his mark. And I'm thinking your Kerry was the same. Yeah. And in that way, I think the loss feels more shared. If there's a whole community that feels a loss, it's not just you feeling that loss.
Absolutely. And I think it just helps you feel supported in the fact that you don't really know what you're doing in the grief process. And I think in time, I don't know whether it was the same with you, but the loss of Kerry was a very public grief, and then eventually it does become private. It becomes special again. And I found that process of allowing it to just be special and not having to share it with everybody, for me, was very meaningful. I'm not sure if you found the same thing, or were you always quite self-contained?
I think my writing for me was my way of doing my own personal grief, and then I think other getting together with people was the more public part. I think perhaps when you asked that question, I think perhaps writing was my way of dealing with how I was feeling, trying to make sense of my own mind and how I was feeling, and to kind of make my own semblance of peace with that, of how I can go forward with it. I think when we talk about friends, when we talk about families, I think that larger friendship base is hugely, I mean, I can't say how much that helped us. On Craig's birthday, we planted a tree at his school in his memory, and on every subsequent birthday, his friends gathered there with their, well, obviously initially it was the parents that organized it, and later on it was the boys. They're now 21, but they still go there every year. They tie balloons on it, they do streamers and take a cake. And initially, for the first 5 years, they said, look, this is what we're doing, just so you know, we don't expect you to be there. And I think after 6 years I went, and then after 7 years Neil came as well, and after 8 years Meg came too. But I think just for friends, if they can organize something that does not demand anything of the direct family, and say you're welcome if you want to, that I can't say how much that helped me to know that he was being acknowledged in a way that he would have absolutely loved, but I didn't have to steel myself for it. Yeah.
Amazing.
Just an aside.
Yeah, and amazing that all these years afterwards they still are meeting around that tree. I mean,
but that I didn't need to initiate it. I think that was wonderful. Yeah. So I thank my friends for that.
So, so you've mentioned that writing the book really helped you a lot. What other things have assisted you, other than, as I say, the book and the fact that people would do things off their own bat, where you didn't have to have any energy or any organizing or anything? Was there anything else that really helped you, particularly, I think, during that initial period, however long that is, a year or so?
I think it's probably, for me, the more people spoke about my child to me, the better.
Yeah.
And not always directly. A lot of people used to, perhaps people that I didn't know terribly well or didn't feel they could come and visit, they'd write me a note and put it in my post box. And they seemed like such little things, but somebody else 2 months later would drop off some brownies. And just that, it's almost a token just to let people know that so it's not intruding on your space. Because I mean, I have friends one friend of mine who also lost a daughter to a brain tumor. All she wanted to do, well, I mean, she's subsequently become a friend because we had such a similar experience. she was on her bicycle and cycling on the mountain. That's what she needed. I was under the duvet. Just completely different responses. And yeah, I think people respecting that and then realizing that you need your space, but finding their own ways of letting you know that they were thinking about you in a very undemanding way. So for me, finding little things in my post box. Another friend of mine is every year on the anniversary of Craig's death, I found on my doorstep a candle with some little flowers around it. And that's, you know, I might not have even seen her in that year. She's not somebody I see all the time, but that's been incredibly meaningful. So I think people probably realizing that I am an introvert and then working around that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know we've spoken about quite a lot of the difficulties that one does experience as a parent, but for you, what were some of the most difficult things that you had to come to terms with or learn to engage with?
After Craig's death,
Yeah.
in the grieving process.
Yeah.
I just think there's something incredibly elemental about adjusting to the fact that one's child is not physically present anymore. I found that just such a mind shift, such an exceptionally difficult thing to do. And I think a lot of my writing was to, you know, I'd always belong to a church, so I come from the Christian faith, but trying to just fit together somehow on those days where you're thinking about them so much, of trying to puzzle, where are they now? How do they exist now? Are they still around on special days? Is there some sort of a connection? It's adjusting to the physical absence of a child, yeah. And I think for us as a family of 3, it's incredibly raw in those first few months. I remember the first car trip when there were 3 kids in the back and not 4. And I mean, it must have been terrible for Meg. I didn't even ask her about it at the time, but Craig's empty seat in the car and an empty seat at a table. And I kept finding I was buying too much food because I was still buying for 4 people. And I had to start buying for 3 people. They're very practical, basic things, and just desperately wanting my son to put his head around the door and say hello, and having to work out he can't do that. And how am I going to live with that? And how do you feel? And also sometimes, and then gradually, I mean, sometimes I just didn't feel anything and I felt quite bad. And I remember the counselor I was seeing just had such great advice. She said, you know what, just don't beat yourself up if you're not grieving every minute. It's like a trip switch that your body's just going, I need a break. You know, it hurts so much the rest of the time. If you're having if your body has just numbed out for a little while, that's okay. And if you find yourself laughing at something, that's also okay. And then eventually coming to that flip of actually Craig would want us to be happy and to do things that honor him and to actually enjoy life, not to sort of dissolve in a heap for the rest of my life, and to try and find ways that for me are meaningful so that I can carry on and do things that make me happy, but in some way still keep him in mind. Yeah.
And did you find in embracing life again, really, that you and Neil and Meg want to do that in different ways? So did that cause any stresses between you, or was that quite an easy journey where this is what we're going to do, we wanted to go on holiday and we're all going to go?
That was very difficult for Neil and I, and we really struggled with it. We did go off to the marriage counselor who helped. You know, it was a bit like one of us was speaking Chinese and one Japanese about what we wanted to do. At that stage, Meg was younger, so she was just pretty much, I think, going with what we were. And she wasn't sort of putting up her hand, which her brother would have done, and went, excuse me, you know. I remember Craig used to always say, how come there's a Mother's Day and a Father's Day and no Children's Day, you know? So Meg's not like that. She just sat quietly and listened to these 2 parents having this bicker about. Neil and I now we're fine with that. We've come to a good understanding. We're much more on the same page. I think Meg's now entered a difficult phase because she's now the young adult. She's working out what her identity is, what she wants to do with her life. and again, obviously, she's now as an adult realizing what happened to her as a 14-year-old, and the shock, that shock has caught up with her. So I think for Neil and I, we've now reached a space where we're much more on the same page. And I think at the moment it's Meg working out how she relates as a single child, having lost a sibling and not ever having been a difficult teenager. She hasn't. Actually, how do you find your path through this life? So I think for her it's come later.
Well, possibly because she's more mature, and as you get older, so you can experience grief at a different level. And one of the people that we saw also mentioned that with this remaining sibling is to remember that they will process the grief according to what age and maturity they are. So when they're 12, there's certain things that they're completely unaware of. And likewise with Meg now, when she's in her 20s, there are things that she would have been completely aware of that now she's aware of as an adult. And that might be, causing quite a lot of difficulty. Because none of us asked for this. None of us asked to be put in this position. And so to be able to make sense of it is hugely important. Because there are some people, Sue, that choose just to remain in that victim mode for the rest of their lives, instead of realizing we don't have to. We would like to re-engage with life as a new and different person. How did you guys find that?
Sherry, I think speaking for myself, I also felt like a victim initially, and I think one still does sometimes. I think the antidote to that is when you start realizing that you're not the only one who's lost a child. And I think the more I got to know people, and also through the writing, then people would get in touch with me, and realizing there's an entire community of people out there who have lost children, that I think feeling like you're the only one who's going through this invites that kind of victim behavior. And I think in a strange way, I've also become less fearful. I think I was a very fearful, overprotective mother, and kind of the worst that could happen happened to my child, and it happened to him. And for whatever reason, it happened to him, and I'm still here. And in many ways, I think I've actually become a bit bolder, because it's, the worst fears happened. Life with other people has carried on. And that's a hard thing to put into words, but
no, I think I think you've done that very well, because in fact for most people, for certainly for most parents, their worst nightmare is to lose a child, which you have experienced. So after that, what can be worse? And there is that one can live with that pain. And there's also that bizarre irony, which I started realizing, and I think the writing also helped me, that of that intense appreciation of life that I developed. I mean, I think we were fortunate in that we had a few months to spend with Craig when we knew that there was this. It was a hopeful couple of months. His chances of surviving were good, but we had a few months of really valuing that life and just seeing things really differently. So I think one's appreciation of life and its potential, very bizarrely, through losing a child, you become more aware of the potential of life and how valuable it is. Absolutely.
And
and so, Sue, if there are mothers who have lost children that are listening to this video and would like to make contact with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Absolutely, I'd love that. Through email. If you're happy to share my email address, my Gmail, that would be wonderful. I'd love to.
We'll absolutely.
I don't have answers for people, because I think what I've also learned is that there are no rules. For everybody, it's different. It's lovely to connect, because I think you are talking to somebody who has been in that same boat at some stage. But I think for each of us, it's a different thing. The timing's different. We make our own rules as we go along. But it does help to have that someone to sound it off, who's not a close family friend or family member or friend. Yeah.
And also has that deep understanding of the how small things can be such big things.
And yeah, so as well, I'm saying we all do it differently. There are also those commonalities, the variations on the theme that we,
So for mothers out there, you can contact Sue, or you can contact me also on my email address, or you can go and join my YouTube channel, where I've got a lot of videos on grief and grieving. Just it's Sherry Forsyth. Have a look for that that channel. You'll get access to all those videos. But if you would like to make contact, please feel free, because it can be a very isolating journey, and our friends don't understand us much as they love us, because they're not experiencing the same journey. So yeah, thank you, Sue, for being available.
I was just going to say, I think often for our friends too, they care so much for us and they are grieving as well. So it is particularly hard. And I think friends can feel quite burdened by our pain because they're also in pain. And it's exhausting for them. So it does help to have other people a bit more on the periphery.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So thank you for being generous with your time, because I'm sure that there'll be people will feel very welcome to be able to reach out to you and well, I suppose share the wisdom of the experience that you have suffered. So Sue,
I'll share my mistakes and my wish I'd done it better with pleasure.
For all of us. Sue, so just to round out the interview, my final question to you is there something else that you would like to share, possibly with mothers who are parents, maybe not mothers only, parents who are going through the loss of a child? Is there anything else you would like to add?
It sounds so cliched, but that self-care thing is huge. I think what I regret doing, I think, is my part of my way of coping with dealing with the loss of Craig was to start volunteering and getting involved in commitments to other people. And I got involved at hospice, which has been wonderfully rewarding, but one's emotional capacity is really low for a couple of years. And I think you need to really keep yourself a huge buffer zone of time, more than you think you need. And I read something so helpful in a book saying that grief, it isolates us from people that are not grieving, but it actually isolates us even more from our fellow grievers. And yeah, advice I was given by one counselor was to actually, the extra energy that I did have to keep for my husband and daughter, not to expend it elsewhere.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's something I struggled. I didn't do it as much as I should have done. Yeah, I should have just kept a bit of energy and a bit of lightness and a bit of joy and a bit of extra for my husband and my daughter, and not being quite so quick to expend it in the broader community. Yeah.
I think that's very valuable, Sue. Thank you for sharing that.
It's wonderful to do those other things, but I think we just need to be very aware of that our energy levels are not quite what they're not what they used to be. If you used to do 8 things a day, it might be 1, it might be nothing. That's normal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Sue, I would like to just thank you so much for firstly your time in giving up for this interview, but I think maybe even more importantly, to have the courage to speak about such a painful event with advice, with humor, with the honesty of showing the reality of what the journey is, what your journey was like in the loss of Craig. And so to help, I want to thank you for helping us to get this video out there. And as I said at the beginning of the video, we want to shatter the silence surrounding it, so it becomes part of everyday living and not something that is sanitized and just left for in the hospitals. So yeah, thank you so much for your courage. Much appreciated.
Love chatting to you. Thanks, Sherry.